this is my passion, to be honest with you. If I were a patient with an implanted device, the way it's done today, sure, there's success in what we do today, but if I were a patient with an implanted device, I would not want the data from my device to go to a cloud, to go to a different site, and then maybe another with some IT hurdles. All the things you talked about that are part of this process are also potential ways that things can get delayed. To then maybe that information gets to my provider, and then maybe or maybe not, I as a patient eventually get to that data. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's an electrophysiologist, and his wife had an implanted device, and we were talking about this, and he said, James, you're right. We had a programmer at home, which is an extreme. But last year at this meeting, we were able to present some data with Medtronic, a patient data share experience. Patients want this data. Patients can handle this data. And I think it's a huge opportunity for us to engage our patients and improve their care.
I completely agree, and we actually just recently ran sort of this double-blinded study that many folks here, I'm sure, participated in as well. And what we found is we need to improve overall simplicity and or overall solutions, right? So nothing was tied to my company specifically, but just generally everything needs to be simplistic. And that's what we need to achieve, I think, as an industry. We need to make it a lot easier, and AI is absolutely going to be the means to do that. It's going to help the deluge of data. We'll be able to focus on what we need to focus on. We'll be able to focus on what everyone has been trained to focus on. And then everything that's normal, that gets bucketed. And then there's an automated way of distributing that to your staff or to those patients. And sometimes it just comes down to simple communication, right? We just did an interrogation. Let's just send an automated message to somebody's text. Everything is okay. You get something that simple. It's not really AI, but something that simple is going to improve the overall accessibility and the buy-in of patients as well, even going back to the first question.
Right. I think we've traditionally had a very paternalistic view of this data, right? That the patient didn't have the right or didn't know what to do with their data, and therefore we were going to digest it for them and tell them what to do. And I think that, again, the wearables have really shown that patients are engaged, right? That patients do know when they're having an abnormal rhythm. They want to know what's going on. And many of these patients, I think, know what to do in response. They know to take an extra dose of metoprolol or make sure they take their anticoagulation. I think AFib lends itself to sort of that formulaic response as opposed to heart failure, where there may be many, many reasons how you got into heart failure. But AFib, we have just a small handful of options, and I do think that we should be engaging patients, allow them to manage their disease and to get us involved when it's no longer manageable. And I think we need to change the way we think about this.
And Christine, can I ask a question on that? To follow up what was said earlier, you talked about data comes in, you message a patient, you send them a text message, right? It sounds very simple. Problem is my preceptors, right? I mean, we can all do this, but this is where you had asked, Christine, you had kind of given us some ideas to think about what do we need? And we need intelligent solutions and implementable solutions that really you're driving. Right. So how do you view that from your perspective? In other words, I can make this very simple, and I can make it very easy for the patient, and very easy for me and for all the practitioners that are taking care of these patients. How do I get you to help me do that for our patients?
I think it's a part of the roadmap from this session, right?
But good answer.
I just want to further emphasize, we, FDA, have had patient engagement advisory meetings where we're hearing directly from patients and their advocacy groups of, we want the data as well. And the number of times this table right here has probably received an email or call saying, insert any manufacturer name here is not sharing my monitoring data with me. I want to see it. And I think we've come a long way where, we're trying to be more transparent about how that information is being relayed. But so not just FDA, but then also clinicians spending that time to explain it and really understanding that interface.
So there is a patient in the audience that takes a different viewpoint, saying that they're not sure they want the data, but they do want it available. And they want the data insights to be shared and to be given appropriate action that need to take place based upon the data. So it will be an individualistic way. And I'm sure that, patients could decide I want in or I don't want into this data, right? So there's another question from the audience about, Rod, about wearable data, and asking about how do you see us moving forward and really bringing up one of the barriers there, which is the lack of outcome data. And, some of it is even lack of validation data, but, showing that that monitoring with these wearable devices impacts outcome. Any thoughts, Rod? I know you're doing
So,
trial.
full disclosure, I'm involved in 2 studies. One is a screening trial using a wearable device to screen the population for atrial fibrillation. And unlike studies like Fitbit and Apple Heart, we're not just finding AFib, we're understanding that if you find that AFib and anticoagulate patients, do you impact outcomes like stroke? And the other study, of which I'm PI on, is called REACT-AF, and this is using a wearable AFib device to do pill-in-pocket anticoagulation to see if we can equally protect patients against stroke while reducing their risk of bleeding and doing so at less cost. So I do think that we can't assume that this technology is favorable, right? We're finding granular levels of disease that we didn't know existed before. It's not the AFib that you and I grew up with where we know that X works and Y doesn't work. So I do think if we're going to really show that this isn't just a toy and saves lives, that we need to do those pivotal trials when we can.
Yeah, I think what Rod's trials are really important because I think we also have to remind ourselves that we've really not been able to show changes in outcomes with pacemaker and ICD-based diagnostics, for subclinical, atrial fibrillation. So it's not just that it hasn't been shown for wearables, it kind of hasn't been shown. Yeah. And much of the, the data that we quote and the outcomes with anticoagulation, with atrial fibrillation, that was kind of the old school, in your face, someone walks in atrial fibrillation, there's a 12-lead EKG. So, I think what you're doing in this trial, Rod, is trying to really show what's not been really demonstrated before, even very well for device-based AF diagnosis.
Well, I would argue that maybe, it depends on how you define the disease. And
right.
You make such great devices, you're picking up a single 6-minute episode that no one would ever have known about. Maybe that's not AFib. Maybe we all have that.
Or maybe that's not enough AFib.
And that's not enough AFib.
Yeah.
And maybe, a device that you wear half the time and is better at picking up hours and hours of AFib is actually going to be better suited.
That might be the sweet spot.
And how we calibrate
yeah.
the sensitivity of these to what is actionable, I think, is still
an open
work
question.
in progress.
Yeah.
Right, and that's going to continue to change, right? I mean, I was watching an earlier session, and it's something I've been talking about for a while on blood pressure. We're so used to having my patients show up once a year or twice a year and check their blood pressure, and we adjust their medications. Well, now we're on the cusp of being able to monitor blood pressure daily through different methodologies. And I've said, well, that's all wonderful because now we're going to completely go back to the beginning of time
right.
and have to figure out how do I manage blood pressure, right? Because now I'm going to get not 2 data points or 10 data points. I'm going to have thousands of data points, and maybe the drug companies are not going to like this. Maybe these patients don't need antihypertensives, right? And by the same token, that's exactly what we're finding here. NOAA AF just came out at ESC. That was a huge trial that basically says we do not need to treat everyone who has we can't even call it atrial fibrillation anymore. It's called atrial high rate events off implantable devices. So the more we find, the more we identify, the more we have to step back and readjust our paradigms to understand, is this in fact atrial fibrillation or is this atrial high rate events, which I have to keep trying to say. We have to make this like an ARA, ARES, something that it's not such a mouthful. And so the more we find, the more we're going to have to go back and relearn and rethink how we treat our patients.
That's a great analogy because, we all thought you found AFib, you should anticoagulate. And now what do we do if we get a couple of blood pressures that are elevated? The likelihood that person would have walked into an office with an elevated blood pressure if they've only had 1 or 2 in the last 2 months is probably unlikely. It's the same thing with getting an EKG with AF. So, yeah, it's really going to be a challenge. And so we brought that up as a challenge. What do we do? Like you say, we go back to the beginning of time. I mean, do we really go back to the beginning of time, or do we make some judgment calls, or what kind of research do we need?
I mean, I would love to hear other people's input, because that's where I keep coming back to is, if I treat them off 2 blood pressure recordings over a year, that's very different than I see this every day. Of course my blood pressure goes up. It would probably be really bad if my blood pressure didn't go up, because you're all stressing me out right now. Right? So, I mean, is that bad? Do I need an antihypertensive now? I don't think so. I hope not.
And I think there are potential for unforeseens. Certainly patient anxiety levels related to wearable devices and having access to their data. We have to understand that that's impactful for them. I think also, potential for harm. You monitor blood pressure every day, and at some point it's going to reach a level that someone is going to decide they need to go to the ER, and they're completely asymptomatic and highly functional. And then you mentioned earlier this wave of data coming in. That's true. Our clinics are not designed to handle this amount of data. So we're not set up to have patients calling every 4th or 5th day saying my blood pressure was X, or I had 30 seconds of this or that or the other. And so I think we're going to have to really embrace things like AFib clinics and hypertension clinics and restructure the way we're going to manage these patients.
And I think I want to bring it around to another aspect of this type of care, and we have to think about underserved communities. And the reality is that many underserved communities don't get adequate medical care within our medical system. And is there a way to use this type of remote care for rural areas, for inner cities, places where they don't have access to medical care? What are the thoughts on that? Because to me, it seems like that could be a very big advantage of rolling out these sort of remote care technologies.
I think a real challenge in these populations often is connectivity.
Right.
We often assume that these patients are connected, and we may overlook a lot of challenges that they have. It may be that if they're in a rural area, they just don't have the
broadband,
broadband for it. But lots of other challenges that we just on a day-to-day would not appreciate. And so connectivity would be an important part of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I can remember back to my days at St. Jude, where we were handing out the Merlin transmitter and they didn't have adequate connectivity, and you were capturing that. And what we told them to do was, well, when you go out to the market, bring your monitor with you, because it had a little USB cellular chip that once you got into range, it would send. So unfortunately, we're still dealing with that type of issue that exists, but I completely agree. I think that's our biggest challenge.
And if we make the assumption that now we can follow patients just remotely and not bring them back into the clinic so often, and these patients specifically aren't connected, then unfortunately we're going to see that they have less access to care than what they had before.
That's right.
And then, of course, the people in those underserved communities have to have access to the devices or the sensors for which they need the broadband to transmit the information. I was actually with a physician a week or two ago who's in a large practice in the DC metro area, and he was telling me that whatever the major health insurer in that region was that provided health care for the employees of their healthcare system was actually providing smartwatches for beneficiaries, because they saw the value in the data in terms of health wellness and health maintenance and preventing problems down the road. But another problem in these underserved communities, of course, is getting access to the insurance.
So we're one of the organizations that we're working with in Connecticut, Griffin Hospital, which is serving that type of underserved community, is using a live core. And so they're prescribing a live core and providing it to their patients, and we're actually taking that data in to PaceMate and aggregating that data and reporting on that data and providing that information back. And it's a way of helping that organization try to serve that community that doesn't have access. Because, who's going to go out and buy a $400, $500 watch? Here, you're dealing with a device which is significantly less. So.
And an audience question is, what solutions from remote care monitoring will actually help with connectivity? what can we do to help? Are there ways that we can make our products more able to work in a rural environment, or is it just really that we need to change the whole broadband system in the United States?
I mean, I think we've learned from from the Merlin experience. You guys know this much better than I do. That Wi-Fi is wonderful, except it's not when you're trying to transmit data. It's not reliable, so it has to be some cellular-based system. And we do see now with cellular-based blood pressure cuffs, the data comes across much more reliably.
Exactly.
I'm sure there's patients in the audience, and I'm going to get shot after this, but I've always said, and I will firmly believe this because I am a patient as well, that the biggest limitation to providing care to patients is in fact the patient. And it may not be their fault. There could be socioeconomic factors involved, but and I do think it's probably naive to think that if we create connectivity that the lower socioeconomic class is going to suddenly, jump onto remote monitoring. There's multiple factors involved. It's trust, it's behavioral, it's cultural. And until you attack every single one of these, this is going to be a problem. The people that actually need the care and can get the most benefit are the ones that we're not getting it to because of these multiple issues that are underlying our limitations.
I think a big part of it is patient engagement. Give the patient a reason to keep this thing transmitting and to follow up to make sure that they're still connected. And I think that's something that the device manufacturers can really work on and are. Things like sharing their activity levels, whether or not they're connected, their AFib burdens, just some standard things that you might find to be able to get that from your device. I agree with you. I would be a horrible patient. I like to swipe up on everything on my phone. How do you keep that thing running in the background? I think there are huge opportunities there.
Yeah, and actually I have one interesting patient. So I was doing a blood pressure management trial out of my practice, and we had Wi-Fi connected devices, and if the Wi-Fi didn't work, they would manually enter their blood pressure. And one of my patients is sitting in front of me, and I'm looking at his blood pressures, and he says, and he's an attorney, very smart, intelligent guy, he says, "Oh, well, I didn't put the bad ones in there." And I'm like, and I stopped, I looked at him, I go, "Dude," and I mean, that's how you're in California. I'm like, "Dude, are you telling me that I'm looking at all this and you just," he's like, "Yeah, I didn't want you to see that." I'm like, all right. So we obviously have to get the data across much more reliably, irrespective of the socioeconomic class.
That's right. Dr. Passman, did you want to say something?
No, I'm really, I think that despite all the wonderful advances we have, if we can't allow people to transmit data from a rural area, and Dr. Yancey spoke today about, there are like 8 million areas that don't have broadband coverage in the United States.
Wow.
And that, the administration is investing like $42 billion, but even that is not expected to resolve this issue. So, if all of this great stuff that we're talking about of allowing people to stay close to their home, not travel 200 miles to see a cardiologist to get an EKG, take time off from work, find care for their children or their elderly, and yet if we can't get that data, it sounds insane.
Yeah, great. All right. So any questions from the audience? I want to make sure we are doing this interactively. I am looking as well. So we talked about, what we have here and what's worked well, and what hasn't worked well, and the fact that we haven't been able to penetrate certain segments of the population. I guess we're having a party now. So we're done. But I think the other thing is that, remote management, just to go back to that a little bit, some patients do want to have the lever, do want to be able to do things from home. I know in LA where I am, everybody wants to try to do it from home. What do you think about getting that paid for? CMS recently just rolled back that we can't do virtual visits anymore. And, what are your thoughts about how we advocate for payment for this kind of care?
Well, I think that in electrophysiology, we've had remote follow-up for a long time. So through our remote follow-up systems, we were able to get a lot of data about patients remotely. With the pandemic, all of a sudden we don't want you to come to the office, but we still want to see how you're doing. So I had never done a remote visit before the pandemic. I don't think many people in my health system did. And all of a sudden we're doing this. And, I hate to be too cynical and negative. The patients loved the remote visits because they were stuck in their house and they were really bored, and here's someone new to talk to and maybe even see on the screen if they could figure out the technology. But I think once I got past the device data, I'm not sure in most patients there was a lot of real utility. I mean, I could kind of sense if someone's respiratory rate was high, if they were kind of like panting when they talked to me. But, I wasn't asking people to try to bring their legs up in front of the camera so I could see if they had edema.
Yeah.
And I think that we really have to think about in terms of saying, well, we really, should get paid as much for a remote visit as we do for an in-person visit. I think we really have to think. I mean, I have friends who's psychiatrists and said this is the best thing ever. Patients love it. It's a little bit harder to get to know a new patient when the whole interaction is virtual, but then with established patients, it's perfect. But I think for a lot of other specialties, I think we have a little bit of work to do in terms of making a case of the value as compared to an in-person visit.
And if I could just interject, I mean, shouldn't this be about options that, some patients want to come see you, some patients need to come see you, and there's some patients who don't need to come see you, especially in our field where you can get data from their implantable device, their wearable device, and save them all those travails I mentioned before. So I don't think that there's a one system for everyone. I would like to see options and taking advantage of what we developed during the pandemic to stay there. It doesn't make sense to me just to simply say this is no longer a way of practice medicine. We used to go to people's homes, right? Things change.
No, I think you're right. I think, but I think they're not necessarily interchangeable in every case.
I agree. And I don't think we should get, reimbursed the same amount. They're typically shorter and maybe to the point, but in many cases, it's much easier to squeeze in a 15-minute telehealth visit than wait for a formal appointment in your typical clinic.
Right. No, absolutely.
I was just going to add, so typically, we would try to avoid to speak for our sister agency, but I will say that data speaks volumes, and I think remote monitoring, there's a lot of information out there, and the benefit of it, the outcomes, and I think continuing to share that with CMS will go a long way.
That's great to see. Yeah. So what about remote programming? What about management of the device, not even having to come in to the clinic?
Well, I guess I can start with that.
I think.
So, I think for loop recorders, it's pretty straightforward. They're diagnostic devices. I don't think there's a lot of debate about whether that's a reasonable thing to do. I think for pacemakers and defibrillators, it's more challenging all around, and I think we need to get there. We all need to demonstrate the safety of how the system works. We're developing a system now, and we have a lot of internal debate, both with our programmers and our compliance legal people about these issues of security. And I point out that no company has any security on their programmer at all. Anyone can walk into any closet in the hospital, pull a programmer off the shelf if they're wearing scrubs, and do what they will. So I'm not really, I say I don't really understand why for remote programming, this whole issue of security is different, since no one has security on programmers in general, and they say, yeah, but we're developing this now, so it's something we're considering now.
I think there's a huge opportunity. When you look at non-actionable alerts coming out of devices, more than half of transmissions are non-actionable. And even if we could just reprogram those in therapy devices, the alerts, that would make a huge impact for the device clinic staff, many of which are not empowered in the clinic. The doctor happens to not be there on the day they're in the office. Maybe they forgot to check the alerts that day, and the 90-year-old went home. Now we can't bring them back for a year. And so I think from a diagnostic standpoint in these devices, it could be done feasibly. And then you think of the patient at end of life and hospice. It would really be an opportunity to be able to turn their therapies off. And I think that should be our goal. And I think it can be done safely with time.
And we have some other questions from the audience, bringing us back to the connectivity issue that we talked about earlier. Bringing up the fact that pharmacies can be a source of a hub. Is there a potential solution using CVS and or Starbucks or other locations with Wi-Fi to deliver care? One of the studies that was done at Cedars-Sinai was a barbershop study where actually, care was delivered in the barbershop. So can we, outfit some of these places with Wi-Fi and therefore maybe turn them into a different setting and it's a community setting where people might get care? Any thoughts on that?
So several years ago, when I was in the middle of Geneva, somebody came to me with that concept, and they thought they had the greatest concept since sliced bread, that we're going to now take the care of implantable device patients to the CVS or whatnot. And then I really looked at him and I just asked him one question. Do you really think that patients should be getting their pacemaker reprogrammed at the CVS? I mean, does that make sense to you? I mean, I think I'm pretty specific.
But they
and
could
I think
get their blood pressure managed.
Well, blood pressure is very different than managing a pacemaker setting, right?
Yeah.
And I think those of us that are sophisticated, and I think this is a panel of sophisticated electrophysiologists, probably all have our pacemakers set pretty nicely as far as lower rate, upper rate, AV intervals, and detection rates. And I don't know that is something that should be done in that setting. I really think that I've always talked about simple data variables and complex data variables. Weight, activity, blood pressure, those are simple data variables. You start getting into pacemaker settings, me personally, I draw that line right there.
I'll throw out two words, and I'll throw these out because I'm not in the CRM industry anymore, but universal programmer, right? If we at least had that, we could at least provide something like that to that type of a setting where there is connectivity and where there is Wi-Fi, and maybe we're not reprogramming, but at least we're interrogating, right? And if we can at least give it to a pharmacist and train the pharmacist to do the interrogation, I mean, it's at least a small step forward.
But with a lot of the newer transmitters, they're aware. It's a phone type device. Now, some people can't afford smartphones even today, but with them, often Abbott, some of their competitors will have a device that they can walk around with, and so really, any place that they hit a cell signal, they don't actually have to go into CVS or Walmart. They're just in a place where there is a CVS or Walmart. Probably at that point, they're transmitting, and so I do think industry has really put a lot of effort there, but we have a ways to go.
I feel like we've been asking for universal programmers for many, many years. And the closest we've gotten is doing more interoperability, right? And there's still a lot of work to be done there.
We were all kind of smiling at each other because, this side of the panel is of a similar vintage and training. And I remember during my fellowship in the previous century, we were talking about a universal programmer and how it would be coming along. So one other, I think it's a great idea, but it's challenging. And then in terms of the, what Abbott does for our smartphone-enabled devices, the ideal is a bring your own device. But for patients that don't have a smartphone, and I lived in Western Pennsylvania before moving to LA, there were a lot of patients who didn't have a smartphone in Western Pennsylvania. We give them a dummy-down smartphone that really has just the app. Mm-hmm. But one thing that we've kind of learned is that patients who are not smartphone people are still not smartphone people when you give them a dummy-down smartphone. Yeah. So it gets you part of the way, but not the entire way. But that problem will go away, over the relatively short term, I think.
So maybe you build that directly into the device without the smartphone required. It's just something the device itself has the capability to transmit.
Yeah, I think our engineers would tell me there's only so much space in those devices, and everybody wants a small device and long life, but I mean it's a good idea.
Christine, can I go back to one question that you had asked before, where you had talked about reimbursement, and so it's tying in a conversation or a comment that Rod had made earlier. Well, why is it that remote monitoring for implantable devices has done so well? Right? We pioneered this space. We didn't pioneer this space. It was the device companies that pioneered this space because they were trying to save costs on their reps running around offices, right? I mean, it's all about the money. I hate to break it to you. If all this goodness, greatness, we care about this, that, or the other, it's all about the money, all right? So why have we not been able to get the data off the Apple Watch yet and manage all that data? Where's the reimbursement model around it? Yes, you can use RPM codes, but then does that even make sense? So that's where, again, it's very incumbent on the preceptors. Now I'm going to look at your table over there. And I'm going to look at your table and tell you that it's incumbent on you to recognize that the physicians are trying to take care of their patients, right? I still practice medicine. I don't need to practice medicine. I don't need 2 jobs. I do it because I still love my patients. And all I want to do is try to take good care of those patients that I've been taking care of now for 15 or 20 years. And to that end, I need a model where you guys help me with your regulation, where you guys help me with the reimbursement, where I can go and build something on the back end or partner with one of these companies. Of course, I'm going to partner with my company, but partner with one of these companies and then be able to manage that data, because everyone and their mother seems to be getting an Apple Watch. How many 80-year-olds are walking around with Apple Watches now? My parents, I bought them the Apple Watch. Same concept. Right?
Well, I think you brought up a great point, that the people who drove the data for remote monitoring were stakeholders.
They were stakeholders.
Right? The people who are creating these are not stakeholders. So now it is incumbent upon us to drive that data. And I think that we need to show that remote monitoring of wearable and consumer-grade electronic devices saves money, keeps people out of the hospital, prolongs life, and just like we did with implantable devices. It's just not going to come from the companies that make the devices. It has to come from us.
That's a good point.
So we are getting a lot of comments from the audience, which is great, and they all came in. So one is I'm just going to look for a couple themes, and one is about prevention. It hasn't been focused on enough. So we've been talking about sort of our traditional device-based care. We talked a little bit about maybe management of hypertension and other sorts of things. What about prevention using these newer technologies? Is there a way that these will empower us to prevent disease? And also, how can they be integrated? Another question was about integrating it into the home. So it's not even just like wearing, but you have a smart home that might, you go reach for the wrong type of food and you get some sort of a negative response,
Shock.
right? Shock, right? Like the dog that barks. So thoughts about that? How, and again, that's a little bit 3 steps away from what we're talking about, but this is what the audience wants to hear about.
Well, I think we should ask the chair, who's made a career of trying to predict sudden cardiac death. How do you think we can use these data?
Well, I think that the main thing, and this is something that another person brought up, is that we have to be able to link these data to some sort of outcome when you're talking about prevention. And you have to do it in a way that is huge, right? So when you talk about preventing even sudden cardiac death is the most common, one of the more common modes of death, but each person only has about a 1 in 50,000 risk of that happening. So how many people would you have to monitor to be able to show that what you're doing is impacting that risk? And it's one of the problems that we learned in the COVID era, that we just don't have a really good way of measuring public health on scale. So I do think that, it has incredible potential, but a lot of times, the companies don't release the data. The data aren't connected to EHR data or to other types of public health data so that we could know that if you are able to find people who have, say, non-sustained VT, and then you evaluate them for that, or you do certain things, then you can prevent sudden cardiac death that way. A lot of people talk about it, AI algorithms to be able to determine, some changes in heart rate that would precede an acute event. All sounds great, but we have to have large studies. That has to be funded to some degree by our public health, our CDC, and because it's not going to be funded by NIH. They're not going to do a 5 million person study, right? So that's sort of some of the things that I think about with it. But I do think the technology is powerful. But without outcomes, I'm not sure we can move that field forward. Other thoughts?
Actually, Christina, I think it's a really very interesting question, right? And there's the term, I always look at cardiac disease as an endpoint. And then you look at the modifying factors that get you to cardiac disease: diabetes, hypertension, obesity, hypercholesterolemia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you modify those variables to try to prevent cardiac disease. That's primary prevention, right? Well, once you have cardiac disease, well, guess what? You come back to modifying the same variables, but now it's not primary prevention, it's secondary prevention. And what the question was really asking was, those variables that actually result in disease, how do you modify those variables from ever occurring in the first place? And that term, and JAG actually used that term, is now called primordial prevention, which is really great because I think of dinosaurs when I think primordial, but this is forward thinking. So primordial prevention. And this is where I think these devices are really going to make a difference, because what are the primordial variables that are going to affect diabetes, hypertension, et cetera, et cetera? It's activity, it's your weight, it's how you're sleeping. That's where I think these things really can make an impact. And I think it's a paradigm shift of how you use these devices to prevent those variables in order to prevent cardiac disease or whatever other disease is going to come down the line. So I think it's a really interesting concept, and it's a matter of how we get there. And we're not even over here as far as outcomes. Over here, it's a whole nother level. But I think there's a lot of potential.
No, you make a good point. I mean, we can measure weight and we can measure all those things, right? How does the wearable reduce weight? I mean, has it really been, I'm just asking, are there outcomes about how it does encourage activity? How do we do that? That's such a hard nut to crack, and how can we use these technologies to do that? Because it would be fantastic.
And of course, those were so limited by the underlying confounding of who gets these devices in the first place, right? They're the motivated people who have the money to do this.
The worried well.
And in fact, the people that are likely to benefit most are the least likely to get one on their wrist. So I think that in some ways it's wonderful, right? 85% of the U.S. population owns a smartphone, regardless of socioeconomic status, right? But what type of smartphone they own and their ability to, buy another device on top of that smartphone, I think is a big limiting step. But we have to figure out a way to, to leverage this device that we all carry with us, because you almost can't get by without it. And certainly the generation that doesn't have it is going to disappear over the next 10 or 20 years. So I think this is going to be the key of how we democratize, preventive care. How to do that and how to reward people for doing that and how to show that that's cost effective, I think is the next phase.
Well, we have a ton of other questions. So there was a couple of questions going back to what we talked about. One was the virtual visits. There was just somebody wanted to put in a reminder that the VA has done this for years, and so it's not just from the COVID era, and that it's worked in several circumstances. So again, a vote for remote visits. And then about interoperability, we heard about that. How would interoperability impact patient care? And what makes it different for different remote care monitoring solutions? So being able to have a single programmer, how does it impact for the audience?
I can start. I mean, where I was coming from was primarily noting if we start in a consistent platform, clinicians are seeing the same information and then patients are being cared for in a more consistent manner, right?
I mean, we can talk about the utopia of a single registry, that all data somewhere exists that everybody can access to, and I think that's great. But when it comes to, and whether we get there or not at some point would be wonderful. And I think as an organization, maybe that's something that we can influence, that's accessible and available. But I think interoperability is key because it makes the data contextual. And you need to see the data we're collecting, whether it's from the implantable devices or it's from the wearable devices or whether it's going to be from any of these scales or whatever it is, integrated into the medical record system so it really becomes meaningful, because other than that, it just becomes very disparate information. So I think interoperability in that sense, I think is critical, and we have to be there.
Christine, can I actually say one thing on that? So many of you may or may not know that HRS has a subcommittee called the IDCO subcommittee, and David Slotweiner, going back to the beginning, back in 11, has done so much work on this committee, and I ran into David earlier today, and I respect him so much for the work that he's done. That data output and the IEEE standard that they created is what we used when we first created the Geneva solution and pulling all that data in order to populate. That same standard needs to happen throughout medicine, right?
Totally agree.
Because the devil is in the details. You can't give me one data set from Philips and another data set from Siemens and another data set from GE, and then I have to manage the patient. That is an impossibility. So it is incumbent, not on the preceptors this time, it's incumbent on the societies to take the lead and then to force that exact methodology. And that's exactly what HRS had done previously, and this needs to happen across the board for the simple data sets, for any and all complex data sets.
And there is as I'm sure you know, there's an ongoing collaboration between HRS and ERA, but as you say, it has to get beyond CRM devices.
Right.
So who needs to be at the table for that, right? Like, we even participated in IDCO, and it was meeting after meeting, right, of EHR folks, companies, but for the next step, who else should be at the table?
I mean, but those are all. It's very interesting, and it is a very slow process. Trust me. When I'm on those calls, I'm like, is the paint peeling? Is it right? And it is a very slow process. But that being said, it's a necessary process. So, but it has to be the producers, the manufacturers. It has to be all the P's I mentioned before. Every one of those P's plays a role in how that is done. Right. So that's my simple answer.
All right. Well, we're getting near the end, and I want to try to wrap up and just give everybody like one shot at saying what they think the next, like if we could do one thing that would really push us a little bit forward, and we've heard a lot of solutions, what would that be? And so I'll start over here again with you, if that's okay. And again, we acknowledging that all of these are important, but what do you think we should be focusing on?
So I'm going to step away from my role at Abbott and kind of focus on some of the themes that have come out, and I think best articulated by Rod. I think we have to get more data. It's not reasonable to expect reimbursement for wearables until we're able to show that wearables make a difference. So I think it's going to be large trials, like Rod's doing, and other similar efforts to create a case, as Hedel said, that we need to show that these things. It's all about changing outcomes. It's not about making diagnoses. It's about changing outcomes.
Yeah, I actually would second that. I think it is about understanding the impact that these upstream devices, regardless of what they are going to impact downstream therapy. And if we can prove that, then I think it's a shorter course to get the reimbursement. And I think it's just going to have this major impact downstream that's going to impact education of where we started with. And I think it's going to bring everybody together, because we'll now have one sort of 360-degree view of that patient. And so, yeah, I think it's critical that we do that. And I think all players need to be involved in this.
All right. Thank you, Rod.
I'm going to go for some low-hanging fruit. I mean, I would just have a smile on my face every day if my patients could get their Cardia and Apple Watch data directly to the EHR, overread, and I could get a report just like I do with my other data. Because I'll tell you, I was an early adopter of this technology, and I have lots and lots of patients who have my email address and phone number. And they love it. It's great. And that was great when there were 20 of them.
Yeah.
But now
It's kind of rough on you.
yeah, but now there's 2,000 of them. It's not scalable.
Right.
So if we could just figure that out, I think that would make my life easier. And patients love this and expect it. And I think that it's done them a lot of good. It's not going to go away. So we need to solve that problem.
I would second the need for data, but before we get there, I think we need to standardize. So that's what I would emphasize.
You want that interoperability. Yep. Okay.
I think it's all about the quadruple aim, right? So when you go to the quadruple aim once upon a time was the triple aim. And the triple aim said that we want satisfied patients, we want to provide value care, low-cost care, minimize costs to the health system, and we want to improve patient outcomes. And in 2014, a family medicine physician wrote an editorial in the Annals of Family Medicine, and he said, that's all great, except you're going to kill the golden goose in the process. You have to have satisfied providers. And what would satisfy provider? Rod just told you. He told you, I just want simple things. So you have to have satisfied patients, satisfied providers, value-based care with good outcomes. And that's the end game. It's a very simple solution, and it's out there, in the quadruple aim.
All right. Thanks, and James.
I think for me, it's really keeping the patient at the focus of what we're doing, keeping the patient at the center, helping them have the tools they need to stay engaged in the process, to be connected, to seek out their providers, to be educated along the way. And then we have to really look at the infrastructure of what we are given as clinicians to handle not only the data, but just the number of patients. All of a sudden, everyone has AFib. And it's largely related to that ease of detection. And when you look at provider burnout, a lot of it's just we're overwhelmed, and we need to look at the structure of our healthcare system.
Well, great. I know I've learned a lot and had some great ideas tossed about. I'm sure that you all do as well now. So I want to thank everybody for attending, and especially when there's alcohol out there somewhere.
And music.
And music. We made it through the music. But thank you all. Thanks for my panel.
Thanks so much.